Well, good afternoon, and it's lovely to see you on Florence Nightingale's birthday. And as you know, this is Nurses' Day, celebrated all over the world because it's the birthday of Florence Nightingale, founder of nursing, modern nursing, I should say. My name's Elizabeth Mason-Whitehead, and I'm Professor of Health and Social Care here. So today, we're just going to have a look at the relevance of Florence Nightingale to modern day nursing. But maybe we start off with that day. And we're going to start off looking a journey from Chester to Florence Nightingale's home. And we're going for her birthday in 1906. So imagine for a moment that you would have set off from Chester Station, and there you would have been on your locomotive, and of course it would have been a steam train. Two of you came to the station by cycle. Do we know which two it was? It was you, excellent.
I was walking.
You were walking, okay. And the time that it would have taken you to get down to London would have been 5 hours and 27 minutes. And you would have got the train that set off at 2 minutes to 6 in the morning, and you would have got in just about 12:30. When you arrived in Paddington, you would have probably taken a hansom cab, as you see there, and have a little look at what London would have looked like in 1906, which of course would be when Florence Nightingale herself was 86. And of course that day was a Saturday. The nurses that you see would have been dressed very much of their time. And then you go to South Street in Mayfair, which doesn't exist anymore. And there she is, Florence Nightingale, very much in her bedroom in South Street. There's a plaque there now, but she'd been ill for quite a lot of years by then. But don't let that kid you, because she did considerable work from her bed. For some of you, maybe this photograph is a little bit of a shock, because you've got quite a defined idea of what Florence Nightingale looked like, probably the lady with the lamp. But there were photographs taken much later in her life, and of course she had a very long life. So if we look back to Florence Nightingale's era, she is of course known as a great Victorian, and it is a time of huge wealth as well as huge poverty. And you can see some of the pictures of the time that maybe in your minds you think very much of the Victorian era. You can see Charles Dickens there, speaking from his lectern, which he did regularly. You can see the slums of London, and there would have been slums in London and Liverpool and Leeds. You can see very much the children of the slums, and you can also see the chimney sweep. But if you look into the picture with the chimneys, it very much marks the time that this was a time of huge activity, of mill workers, of the Industrial Revolution, of production, and of a vast growing population, particularly moving from the rural to the urban areas. You'll look up again and you'll see nurses of the time. If you look down into the corner there, you'll see the huge wealth. And in many ways, that was the wealth in which Florence Nightingale herself was born. And there we have it. There she is. If we look at those photographs, we can see the top one here, this one here, that is Lea Hurst, and that one is in Derbyshire, and she came back from the Crimea War to Lea Hurst in Derbyshire. It's now a private house, but she always said that that was her favourite residence. And if you look along there, that's Embley, which is in Hampshire, and that's one of the Nightingale's homes, which is now a school, a private school. If you look down below Lea Hurst, there's Florence sitting with her sister, Parthenope. And you can see Florence is sitting on the chair, and even at that very early age, she's moving her face away from the portrait, and that was a portrait. Interestingly, I was looking for a Chester connection, and Florence was christened by a Dr. Trevor of Chester. So there is quite a Chester connection with Florence Nightingale. If you look next to that picture, you'll see her father, William Nightingale. And interestingly, William Nightingale was probably the most significant and the most profound influence in her early life. I myself think there's a little bit of a connection here in how Florence Nightingale was brought up, and also in how Beatrix Potter was brought up. Very similar. Of course, Florence Nightingale's father was not originally Nightingale. He was a Shaw. And for inheritance, they had to change their name from Shaw to Nightingale. But if she'd been called Florence Shaw, would it have been quite the same? Of course, we'll never know. No, a few shaken heads there. And there's Florence and her sister with her very protective mother. Sitting next to her, that I think is a nice pencil drawing of Florence Nightingale, and shows how very much she was a scholar, and she most certainly was. She was very highly educated, particularly from her time. So, the conversation that we're going to have. And what I was asked to do was to look at the relevance of Florence Nightingale's world compared to today. And I could have taken any number of themes. This isn't so much a canter through Florence Nightingale's life, but a look at the themes that are relevant from her time to what we have today. So I've looked at shared values, the development of our profession, nurse education, inquiry and evidence, public health, changing and constant, caring in conflict, reflection, the media, very important in Florence Nightingale's life, and the community, returning home. So we'll look to see where those similarities are. If we start off with shared values, we can see here that in Florence Nightingale's time, she set up the idea of environmental theory. And if we look at that theory, and we look at how we think today, you can see that there is actually a lot of essentials that we would regard as hugely important. To understand why she came up with such concrete ideas, I suppose really we need to look back at her life. And when we look back at those particular times, the population was increasing dramatically. They couldn't keep up with the housing, particularly in the large cities, where we needed mills, manufacturing, where there were a lot of dirty industries, and where there were a lot of diseases as a result of those injuries. So hence, fresh water, fresh air, drainage, sunlight became hugely important. And her idea was to, as it were, manipulate the environment in a way that would assist a patient's recovery. And so changing the environment for Florence Nightingale was hugely important. And that, of course, very much reflects somebody of her time, and many of the sanitary reformers of her time, and the public health doctors of her time as well. If we go across to where we are today, there we are, University of Chester nurses and midwives, and we can see part of our culture is compassionate care. And of course, in Florence Nightingale's time, she would see that as compassionate care too. The underlying principles are very much the same. And you are very well aware of your 6 C's, which I'm sure you have spent a lot of time studying. Is that right? Yeah. So, the development of our profession. If we look at the top picture, we can see Florence Nightingale there. And again, she tends to evade her eyes from the camera. But you can start to see some of her steely comments. And when you look at that comment, I attribute my success to this: I never gave or took any excuse. It's a hard one to follow that, I have to say, for my own part. But it demonstrates, perhaps, how steely she was. If we look down at the bottom, the picture at the bottom is actually Emmeline Pankhurst, because no profession develops on its own. And the time that you're going to Florence Nightingale's birthday party in 1906 was a time of great strife for the suffragette movement. There was considerable riots, marches, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But this one is Emmeline Pankhurst, who has been imprisoned for her suffragette work and votes for women, which of course they didn't get until 1918. If we look at the middle one, I put that in because I thought you might be interested in a way almost of crossing the 2 eras, and that of course is the rise of feminism. Now, whether Florence Nightingale was a great feminist is something for you to think about. There lies another lecture. But nonetheless, by and large, nursing has and continues to be a women's dominated profession, unfortunately. And we are always wanting more men to join nursing. But in its early days, it was one avenue where women could really make an independent career for themselves. And this is something that Julie wanted me to talk to you about. If you look at across there, you will see student nurses, just as yourselves, starting off today with your code, your NMC code. And there you are, Royal College of Nursing, which of course is 100 years now, 100 years old. And also, there you are, going across to get your degrees. So the development of our profession has moved along with much of the time, and it's been a period of huge change. Nurse education. If you look at the right-hand side, you can see Florence there with her students. She's probably outside St Thomas's Hospital, which was the school of nursing that she developed. And again, if you haven't seen photographs of Florence Nightingale, you might be a little taken aback by this, because we don't quite imagine her to be like this. But she was very close to her student nurses. And the book next to that is Notes on Nursing. Nurses have always written textbooks, and our faculty is particularly good at writing textbooks. And if we look at the bottom photograph there, that's Debbie Wyatt. And I think this is one of the last, most recent books that we've had. And this is her book on palliative care and cancer nursing. So we have a strong tradition here of writing textbooks. But you can see very much how constants still move, and we still continue to write textbooks. In Florence Nightingale's time, if you can imagine this, you would have had 2 or 3 textbooks. No media to draw upon. Much easier to write your exams and your assignments with. Caring in conflict. Now, the picture to your right-hand side, does anybody know who that is? It is Mary Seacole. It is. And it is probably one area of Florence Nightingale's life, and no doubt there are others, that we find difficult to understand, because whilst there was the conflict of the Crimea, which of course is what she became famous for, she also became famous for her relationship with Mary Seacole, which to this day we're not particularly sure about. But one thing we do know, that there was considerable antagonism from Florence Nightingale towards Mary Seacole. And in recent years, there has been, fortunately, a real appreciation of Mary Seacole's work and Mary Seacole herself and her contribution that she made to the Crimean War and to health and to nursing. And we owe Mary Seacole a great deal in that regard. The photograph below, the picture below, is 1856, which was the year that Florence left the Crimea and came back to England, came back to Derbyshire. She was only in the Crimea for under 2 years, 1854 to 1856. But it shows the end point of what her hospital in Scutari looked like. And this is quite a famous picture from the Wellcome Library. Pretty ordered. Of course, it wasn't there like that when she got there. And when she got there, she faced complete turmoil. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Caring in conflict has not stopped, as well we know. And in our university, we have the Westminster Centre for Research and Innovation, for veterans' well-being. And it's a recognition of the continuing work that nurses do in conflict. And we've got professors here, and we've got one member of staff here today, who's done considerable work overseas and in conflict. And it is often in times of conflict, and you will see this down in the museum, when we look at the First World War, that the great step changes are made in caring and nursing. We just have to think of things such as the Thomas's splint, blood transfusion, work on plastic surgery and so forth. Reflection. Now, we talk a lot about reflection, and sometimes people think that reflection is quite a new thing. And indeed, this extract that I've got from Elizabeth Halcombe is a 2016 one, and it shows the relevance of reflection. But one thing about Florence Nightingale in relation to the piece that you see from 1855 was that she had the ability to reflect and change and act upon it. And all credit to her for doing that, because the world's eyes were watching her at that point. And it must have taken some doing. Very little would have been known, but a lot would have been been thought about at that particular time, and a lot of investigation, and there was a lot of work around public health, which I'll talk about in a moment. So before the death rate fell in Scutari, it rose. But she started to understand the reasons why that was so, and subsequently acted upon it. A reflector, and no bad thing for that. Inquiry and evidence. If we look at the little emblem there, that is the Statistical Society of London. And there were many such societies around the country at that time. It's a real reflection on how people were so concerned with the rise of disease, the high mortality rate, and a real determination to reduce infectious diseases, that the Statistical Society was formed. And there were statistical societies all around the country. For example, here in Chester, there was the Smallpox Society, and that was, of course, attributed to John Haygarth. If we look at the man next to that emblem, he's William Farr. And William Farr was a great epidemiologist. And he actually helped Florence Nightingale in her statistics. And she was a good statistician. There's no doubt about that. And William Farr himself did considerable work around cholera, and he helped Florence with her statistics, which is why you've got this little chart here, the forerunner of what we call now the pie chart, and every nursing lecturer talks to the students about the pie chart, but of course that was a coxcomb, and it looked at illness and disease, contagious illnesses, seasonally, and also she looked at the epidemiology of the British Army in India at that time. So Florence Nightingale and William Farr worked quite a lot together. If we go to public health, we can see that it's very much changing and constant. And I'm sure you know the man in the corner there. That's Edwin Chadwick. And the famous Public Health Act of 1848, and subsequent public health acts as well. And if you look down there at those two photographs, you can imagine the frustration that they must have felt, and you can imagine the enormous challenges that were in front of them. Cholera was one of the big killers of its time. And one of the things that caused so many people to be so interested in public health was that many wealthy people lived so close to many people who were so poor. Hence, it was put right in their face, as it were. That's the cruelty of it. So, Florence Nightingale, without question, was a public health reformer. And I'm just going to nip to this other slide for a moment. Here is a letter written by Florence Nightingale to Edwin Chadwick. And there, in that letter, you can just see her signature at the end. In that letter, there were her concerns about TB. And so whilst we know very much about Florence Nightingale as rooted in the Crimea, when she also did really exceptional work in relation to public health before and after she went to Crimea. But this is the world that we live in now. And that's why I say that the public health is changing and also a constant. Because if we look at the new public health framework that's just coming out for 2016, one of the big areas in there is looking at children in poverty. And if you just for a moment look at those two photographs, one of the 1840s and one of 2016, it's an extremely sobering thought. And it makes us wonder how much, if Florence Nightingale was sitting here today, she would probably have quite a lot to contribute to this conversation, and she would probably have quite a lot of thoughts about it. But it is a very sobering and disturbing thought, and the challenges, of course, rest very much at the door of nurses and public health policymakers. I've put in there Anta Mabala's and Francis Wilson's book on public health because it demonstrates our efforts as a faculty to address public health, to talk about public health, to write about it. And this book, like others, will go across the world. That'll be read by students and nurses from across the globe, and extremely important it is, the value of writing. Smart writing to smartphones. Now then, Florence Nightingale, in large, became famous for the Lady of the Lamp because of journalism and because of this man here, William Russell. And William Russell was an Irish journalist who wrote for the Times, and he went to the Crimea and he reported back on that. He reported back from the Crimea, and he noted how poor the nursing standards were. In fact, they were non-existent. And he wrote in the Times, and the Times subsequently wrote a number of pieces, and a fund was set up for the Crimea, and it became extremely important. And from that, Florence Nightingale read his piece, and she read the number of lives which have been sacrificed by the want of proper arrangements must be considerable. And that was her call to arms, as it were. And she subsequently was called to take her nurses, and of course there were 38 nurses, and there lies another lecture, their journey on how they got to Crimea. But of course I had to put her lamp in, her famous lamp, and that again, the Turkish lamp, is very much as a product of journalism. And when she came back in 1856 to Derbyshire, she couldn't believe how much had been written about her. She was not expecting to come back as a heroine, but it was entirely due to journalism that she had done so. And there you are, today with all your smartphones, and the world is completely different in that regard. And we can see how nursing has been portrayed in both a positive way and a negative way. For example, you might want to think about the Francis Report. You might want to think about positive things have come out about nursing in that regard and what happens next, but equally negative things have come out, and how much is in proportion. And nurses, and this is something for you to think about, have always been very much the subject of media concern, shall we say. Returning home. In Florence Nightingale's time, there weren't many hospitals. In fact, it was one of the issues that came up in relation to the First World War, Because in the First World War, of course, many stately homes were converted into hospitals because we just didn't have the numbers. There would have been workhouses for the very poor. So most people would have died at home. And remember again, this was a time of rising population, huge infection. And those messages that she wrote in Notes for Nursing were extremely important because many people would have read them at home. The importance of fresh air and light and food and rest and quiet. She was very big on quiet. But if we look across, we've now moved again, slightly, in that regard, into Florence Nightingale's era, where we have a growing number of people now who are being not only looked after at home, who are sent home early from hospital, but who are also dying at home. And you can see from this report, from Public Health England, the number of people dying at home continues to rise. And that in part is due to our big focus now on community care, probably more so than ever before, that doesn't just involve nurses, but involves a whole range of caring people. So you've had quite a lot to talk about, Florence Nightingale. In fact, it's been quite a happy little conversation you've had there. So, you come back. Now, I can tell you that you returned home, a time for remembering, reflecting, and relevance for today. And maybe some of the things that you'd like to do is to think, well, what would you like to give Florence Nightingale on her birthday party? And one of the things that we'd like you to do is to add your thoughts onto our Facebook page. So maybe you might do that. However, you did nearly miss. And you got caught up. Some of you, those two that were on the cycle at the beginning, you also brought down with you your placard for Votes for Women, and you slightly escaped. These posters would have been very much at the time. You got caught up in a rally for Votes for Women. I don't know who it was that got dragged away, but somebody did. And that's very much of the time, 1906. Thank you. Has anybody got any questions? No? All good?
Is it true that when Louis Pasteur...
Sorry, you're right, just use the mic.
No, I'm okay.
Just for the...
Is it true that when Louis Pasteur published his paper on microbes that Florence Nightingale wouldn't believe it? He said they don't exist. Or is that something I've just heard as rumour?
Is it true that when Louis Pasteur...
Published a paper explaining microbes and bacteria that Florence Nightingale couldn't believe it?
That's quite possibly true. That is quite possibly true. I couldn't say that for stone, but it is quite possibly true. And it did take her some time to very much get round to that thinking, because the Victorian times, and there were so many people, Lister and so forth, who were working on that kind of work. And Florence Nightingale, of course, was very much rooted in miasma theory and so forth. And for her to acknowledge that would have been quite a big step. But she did do that eventually. And in her very long life, she saw a massive change in thinking. And she would have started off very much in an old-fashioned way of thinking of its time and would have had to move, as it showed what happened in Scutari there. That is quite possible. I will look it up and check for you. No?
about the public health issue, yeah. And I know you focused mostly on Chester, but you could have said a lot more about Florence and the public health with regard to William Rathbone.
Oh, most certainly. Absolutely, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, gosh, yes, absolutely, yes. Yes.
And also William Rathbone and Florence, who got in touch with Florence with regard to the advice that he required with regard to home nursing and the staff of district nursing.
Oh, completely. Yes, that's absolutely right. And of course, Florence came to Liverpool a number of times, and she also sent one of her district nursing sisters up to Liverpool, and I think she also sent them up to Leeds as well. And one of the things that she was very concerned was to ensure that her best sisters came up to cities such as Liverpool and Leeds. And of course, Liverpool University still carries the Rathbone Community Nursing Professorship. Absolutely, yes, that's a very good point, yeah.
Given her interest in nutrition, do you think she still would have allowed us to have cake today?
Well, it's an interesting point, because one of the things that people notice about Florence Nightingale is the early comments about her were how slender she was. And one of the things, as she herself got older, that disappeared somewhat, and that may have been because she was very much bedridden. Would she have had cake today? Without question. Without question, yes, particularly if it's been made by you, I'm sure. Okay, thank you very much.
I think on behalf of the faculty, we should thank Elizabeth.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.
Still more cake, I think.
Still more cake. Excellent. Was it good? Do you know, all the time. Sorry, is that off now?
Yeah, it is.
My phone. I hadn't turned my phone off, and all the time I was slightly.